Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, has reportedly approved the creation of a new African country called Biafra, located in southeastern Nigeria. Biafra was originally a secessionist state declared independent in 1967 by Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, leading to the Nigerian Civil War, which ended in 1970. In 2014, Nnamdi Kanu revived the Biafran independence movement by founding the Indigenous People of Biafra, IPOB. Nnamdi Kanu was arrested by Nigerian authorities in 2015, released on bail in 2017, but his home was later raided by the military, prompting him to flee to the UK. In 2021, while in Kenya, Nnamdi Kanu was abducted by Nigerian security forces, allegedly with Interpol's help, and taken back to Nigeria, where he remains detained. Nnamdi Kanu reportedly holds dual citizenship, Nigeria and the UK, and his arrest raised international human rights concerns. Despite being granted bail by a federal high court in 2024, the Nigerian DSS has refused to release him. Simon Ekpa, in the other hand, is a controversial figure and the Prime Minister of the United States of Biafra. In November 2024, he was arrested by Finnish police and is reportedly being detained in Finland prison. President Ibrahim Traoré has now expressed support for Biafra's sovereignty, urging Nigeria to respect the will of the southeastern people. The situation is unfolding, with expectations of political reactions from Nigeria and further developments in the coming months. In the shifting sands of African geopolitics, few events have stirred as much attention and emotional response as the recent support voiced by Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, for the creation of a sovereign Biafran state in southeastern Nigeria. This move has reignited decades-old debates about national identity, self-determination, justice, and the memory of civil conflict. President Ibrahim Traoré, known for his bold and unconventional leadership style, especially considering his youth and position as one of Africa's youngest leaders, has now positioned himself at the center of one of the continent's most sensitive political matters. The idea of Biafra is not new. The name carries heavy historical weight, not just in Nigeria but across the African continent. The origins of Biafra as a political movement date back to the late 1960s, specifically in 1967, when a military officer named Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu declared the southeastern region of Nigeria as an independent republic. This bold declaration led to the Nigerian Civil War, a 3-year conflict that lasted from 1967 until January 1970, claiming over 1 million lives, mostly due to starvation and leaving deep scars on the national psyche. Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu's decision was driven by a series of political and ethnic tensions that had plagued Nigeria since its independence in 1960. At the heart of the Biafran secession was the feeling among the Igbo people, an ethnic group dominant in southeastern Nigeria, that they were politically marginalized and economically exploited. The discovery of oil in the region had only intensified the economic value of the southeast, making it not just a cultural and political matter, but one of financial significance as well. However, the Republic of Biafra was short-lived. Despite early diplomatic efforts and some international sympathy, most of the global community sided with the Nigerian federal government. After intense military campaigns and blockades that led to widespread famine, the Biafran forces surrendered in January 1970. The dream of an independent Biafran state was effectively quashed, and Nigeria officially declared that there were no victors, no vanquished. Yet for many Igbos and supporters of the Biafran cause, the sense of loss and injustice never fully disappeared. Fast forward to the year 2014, and the dream was revived once again, this time not by a military figure, but by a British-Nigerian activist named Nnamdi Kanu. His goal was simple but immensely ambitious: to reignite the push for the southeastern region of Nigeria to become an independent state, free from what many saw as systemic marginalization by the Nigerian government. He quickly became a polarizing figure in Nigerian politics. To his supporters, he was a freedom fighter, a visionary, and a voice for the voiceless. To his critics and the Nigerian authorities, he was a dangerous separatist who was threatening the unity and peace of the nation. Nnamdi Kanu's activities did not go unnoticed. On October 14, 2015, he was arrested by Nigeria's Department of State Services, also known as the DSS, while staying at the Golden Tulip Essential Hotel in Lagos State. This arrest sparked nationwide protests, especially in the southeast, where many saw it as an attack on their collective rights and aspirations. Despite the tensions, in 2017 a federal high court in Nigeria granted Nnamdi Kanu bail. But this moment of relief was short-lived. On September 10, 2017, heavily armed Nigerian soldiers raided his residence in Abia State in an event that remains controversial and highly criticized to this day. According to various reports, soldiers arrived with significant firepower, prompting chaos and fear among residents. Realizing that his life was in immediate danger, Nnamdi Kanu fled Nigeria. He escaped to the United Kingdom, where he also holds citizenship. There he continued his activism, using platforms like Radio Biafra and social media to promote the ideals of Biafran independence. From London, he operated with relative freedom, though tensions between his movement and the Nigerian government only grew more intense. Then came June of 2021. Nnamdi Kanu traveled to Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, for reasons that remain partially unclear. It is widely believed that he was there for a private or organizational event related to the Biafran movement. However, Nigerian authorities had reportedly been tracking his movements for some time. With assistance allegedly from Interpol and possibly some Kenyan officials, Nigerian security agents orchestrated a covert operation. On June 27, 2021, Nnamdi Kanu was abducted from his hotel room in Nairobi, drugged according to some reports, and forcibly flown back to Nigeria. His rendition was described by many international observers and human rights organizations as a gross violation of international law, especially considering his dual citizenship and the absence of any known legal extradition procedure. Upon his return to Nigeria, Nnamdi Kanu was detained in a high-security facility operated by the Department of State Services in Abuja. Since then, he has faced multiple court hearings, trial delays, and legal controversies. In 2024, a federal high court in Abuja once again granted him bail. But the DSS refused to comply with the court order, continuing to detain him in what many have described as a direct challenge to the authority of the judiciary. This refusal has been widely criticized by legal experts, activists, and international bodies concerned with human rights and the rule of law. In the meantime, another name began making waves in the Biafran political movement: Simon Ekpa. Simon Ekpa, a Finnish Nigerian citizen, became a prominent voice and, controversially, declared himself the Prime Minister of what he calls the United States of Biafra. His approach and methods, however, have divided opinions. While some view him as continuing the mission started by Nnamdi Kanu, others consider his methods too extreme and damaging to the original movement. His relationship with Nnamdi Kanu and IPOB leadership has also been fraught with tension. In November 2024, Simon Ekpa was arrested by Finnish police and is currently being held in Kiilamäkoski Correctional Center in Finland, facing ongoing investigations. Despite the internal divisions within the Biafran movement, the most surprising and unprecedented development came in 2025. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, in a move that stunned political analysts, declared his support for the sovereignty of Biafra. This statement, delivered in an official capacity, called on the Nigerian government to recognize and respect the will of the people in southeastern Nigeria. President Ibrahim Traoré emphasized that the right to self-determination is enshrined in international law and that the Igbo people deserve the chance to chart their own political future. This endorsement marks the first time an African head of state has openly recognized Biafra's claim to sovereignty since the end of the civil war. It represents a shift in how the Biafran issue is perceived, not just in Nigeria, but across the African continent. The reasons behind Ibrahim Traoré's endorsement are still being debated. Some believe it is a strategic move to challenge Western influence and colonial-era borders that still define African politics. Others think it reflects a broader Pan-African sentiment, an idea that African nations must support each other in fighting marginalization and oppression, even if that means challenging established norms. The situation is still developing, and many questions remain. How will the Nigerian government respond to this challenge to its territorial integrity? Will more African countries follow Burkina Faso's lead? What role will international organizations, such as the African Union or the United Nations, play in mediating or intervening in this conflict? These are just a few of the questions that now shape the unfolding story of Biafra. The declaration made by President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso did not go unnoticed in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. Within hours of the public statement in support of Biafran sovereignty, officials within the Nigerian government began to respond. There was no official press conference initially, but statements from senior political aides and spokespeople quickly circulated on social media and among journalists. The tone was firm, sometimes emotional, and unmistakably defensive. The Nigerian government reaffirmed that Nigeria remains a sovereign, indivisible country, and that any attempt to alter its borders or undermine its national unity would be treated as an act of aggression. Inside the corridors of power in Abuja, discussions reportedly turned to whether diplomatic ties with Burkina Faso should be reconsidered. While there was no immediate recall of ambassadors or severing of formal relations, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the Burkinabe ambassador for explanations. Government insiders, speaking anonymously, revealed that some members of the Nigerian presidency were pushing for sanctions or at least a formal diplomatic protest. The Nigerian government has long regarded the Biafran movement as a threat to its unity and sovereignty, and to hear a fellow African leader give support to it publicly was seen as crossing a red line. Politically, the support from President Ibrahim Traoré added fresh energy to the Biafran cause at home and abroad. In southeastern Nigeria, cities like Enugu, Aba, and Onitsha witnessed spontaneous rallies and gatherings. In these places, people waved Biafran flags and chanted slogans of freedom. For many young Igbos who have grown up hearing stories about the civil war only through their parents and grandparents, this was the first time in their lives that the Biafran idea had received international backing from an African state. It was no longer just a dream whispered in private or debated on radio stations. It was now part of an international political conversation. But international recognition of new states typically follows a pattern. First comes local governance and control over territory, then comes regional support, and finally, global diplomatic recognition. Biafra, at this stage, lacked control over any formal territory, and its leadership remained divided and under legal pressure. But with Burkina Faso's endorsement, the movement had taken its first real step onto the global stage. Back in Nigeria, public opinion remained deeply divided. In the northern and southwestern parts of the country, many Nigerians viewed the Biafran agitation with suspicion or hostility. Some feared that if Biafra succeeded in breaking away, other regions might follow suit, leading to national collapse. Others believed that dialogue and structural reforms could address many of the grievances that had fueled the separatist sentiment. Within the southeast, however, the conversation had clearly shifted. Biafra was no longer just a historical memory. It had become a living political project with new possibilities. Religious leaders, traditional rulers, and even some elected officials began to weigh in. A few offered cautious support, calling for a referendum to allow the people of the southeast to decide their political future. Others warned that pushing too hard could lead to another civil war. Memories of the 1967 to 1970 conflict remain vivid in the national consciousness, and many families still carry the trauma of those years. No one wanted to see that kind of bloodshed again. As 2025 progresses, the situation remains fluid and highly sensitive. President Ibrahim Traoré's declaration has opened a door that may not be easily closed. For the first time in decades, the Biafran question is no longer a purely Nigerian issue. It has become a continental and perhaps even global one. What happens next will depend on how both Nigerian leaders and Biafran activists navigate this uncharted territory. As the political landscape continues to shift, many observers are beginning to ask serious questions about what the future holds for Biafra. For decades, the dream of an independent Biafran nation has existed largely as an emotional and symbolic hope for many in southeastern Nigeria. Now, for the first time in recent history, that dream has gained a powerful political ally in President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. But how this support translates into practical, legal, and international recognition remains uncertain. To understand what lies ahead, one must first understand the international framework that governs the creation of new nations. Under international law, the right to self-determination is recognized, but it is balanced by the principle of the territorial integrity of existing states. This means that while a people may have the right to govern themselves, they cannot unilaterally break away from a country unless there are extraordinary circumstances, such as severe oppression or the total breakdown of political rights. The United Nations Charter mentions self-determination, but only in the context of decolonization or where fundamental human rights are consistently denied. This is where the legal and political case for Biafra faces both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, advocates for Biafran independence argue that the people of the southeast have faced decades of marginalization. They point to the limited federal investment in infrastructure, the underrepresentation in national leadership, and what they describe as targeted military and police brutality in the region. For these advocates, the continued detention of Nnamdi Kanu despite a court order for his release is yet another example of how the rule of law is not equally applied in Nigeria. On the other hand, critics of the Biafran movement argue that Nigeria is a democracy where every citizen, regardless of region, has the right to vote and run for office. They point out that the Southeast has produced governors, senators, ministers, and even a vice president. They argue that what is needed is not separation, but reform and reconciliation within the framework of a united Nigeria. These critics also warn that the fragmentation of Nigeria could lead to chaos and suffering, as was seen during the Biafran War in the late 1960s. In the diplomatic arena, Biafra's path forward will depend greatly on whether other African leaders follow in President Ibrahim Traoré's footsteps. If other African nations begin to publicly support the right of southeastern Nigeria to pursue independence through democratic means, such as a referendum, then the Biafran movement may gain momentum. A key strategy for the movement is to win over the African Union, which has traditionally maintained a strict policy of respecting the colonial-era borders inherited by member states. However, the African Union is not immune to pressure from its members, and a strong coalition of countries could potentially influence its stance. At the same time, Biafran activists and supporters abroad, especially in Europe and the United States, are working to raise international awareness. They organize rallies, write petitions, and meet with lawmakers to make the case for their cause. In particular, they emphasize the legal injustice of Nnamdi Kanu's continued detention, the need for international observers in southeastern Nigeria, and the importance of peaceful self-determination. They are not asking for war or conflict, they say. They are asking for the right to choose their future through democratic means. The situation also raises broader questions about the nature of African unity. For decades, African leaders have spoken about Pan-Africanism, a vision of a united continent built on shared values, cultures, and struggles against colonialism. But this unity has often come at the cost of suppressing internal demands for autonomy. The challenge now is to redefine what unity means. Can Africa be united while also recognizing the right of different ethnic and regional groups to determine their own political destiny? Can borders drawn by European powers over a century ago continue to define the identity and governance of African peoples today? This debate is not unique to Nigeria. Across the continent, many regions and groups feel disconnected from the centers of political power. In Cameroon, the Anglophone regions have long sought greater autonomy. In Mali and Niger, Tuareg populations have demanded recognition and self-governance. In Ethiopia, the Tigray conflict has reopened questions about the federal structure of the country. The case of Biafra could serve as a catalyst for a larger continental conversation about governance, identity, and the balance between unity and self-determination. Returning to the immediate situation in Nigeria, the federal government now faces a critical choice. It can continue to treat the Biafran movement as a security threat, responding with arrests, military crackdowns, and censorship. Or it can choose a different path, one that involves dialogue, recognition of historical grievances, and perhaps even the establishment of a legal and democratic framework for determining the wishes of the southeastern people. A referendum, overseen by independent observers and international partners, could offer a peaceful way to resolve the question, though it would also carry political risks for the government in power. For President Ibrahim Traoré, his bold support for Biafra has already established him as one of the most independent and unconventional voices among African leaders. Some admire his courage in challenging the status quo. Others see his move as reckless and dangerous, potentially destabilizing the region. Either way, his endorsement has changed the dynamics of the Biafran question and given it a legitimacy that it has not enjoyed in years. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.